Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Rick Wilson to Against All Enemies. I am delighted to be joined today by Vicky Ward, who is a writer who has delved into two of the most pressing family dynamics that you will hear about in the Trump universe. Gislaine Maxwell, who did the amazing series Chasing Gislaine, and also wrote the definitive book about the Kushners, Jared et al., which I think was the last time we talked was about that book. But Vicky, thank you for coming on today. I want to start out by asking, we just learned today that that Maxwell has been moved from a prison in Florida to a prison in Texas. And there's a thought rumbling around that this is preparatory to her either having her sentence commuted or receiving a pardon. Should we release Gislaine Maxwell from prison, knowing what you know about her?
Absolutely not. That's a very simple one. You know, there's been a talk rumbling on the right in the last week or so that Gislaine Maxwell was a victim of Jeffrey Epstein's, having sat through Gislaine Maxwell's criminal trial and, reported on this story for over 2 decades. And having known Gislaine Maxwell, that is absolutely not the case. Right. She was not just a predator and Epstein's accomplice. She really went out and betrayed her own gender. The only reason these vulnerable girls entered Jeffrey Epstein's front door, kitchen door, side door, and they were up the stairs on their way to his massage room was because Gislaine Maxwell had lured them in, right, exuding this fake veneer of respectability, trying to normalize his sexual practices with teenage girls, so that they would be groomed into doing his bidding, not just, by the way, having to have sex with him, but then going out, being paid and going out to recruit other girls. It was a pyramid scheme, and she was at the top of it.
Yes, everyone that I've talked to, who has in the last couple of weeks, who's known of her or known her closely, has used that word, predator. And right. and she was also sexually abusing these young girls, which I think is something we should not leave on the table in this discussion. But talk to us a little bit more. I don't think as Americans have as much of a grasp of her origin story. And that's something that you delved into, particularly in the series you did. Talk to us about where she came from and how we ended up with this very strange and, some people were saying she was broken. I think evil is a better word. But talk to us about her origin story and why she is this figure who's able to go in and sort of, as my friend Stuart Stevens says, spread that pixie dust of English gentry affluence and connections to royalty and all those things to these very naive young girls.
Well, it is a complicated story, and it is a sad story. It is again not a story of victimhood. Gislaine Maxwell grew up with every privilege, the daughter of a very wealthy, self-made media mogul, Robert Maxwell. He was also briefly a politician. Right. Her father was an obese, charismatic bully. Sounds deliberately contradictory. He was a man who most people believe was, an agent. He was so well connected around the world, partly through his newspapers, or he also owned a publishing company, the Pergamon Press, that published scientific journals. Leading scientific journals of countries tend to contain interesting information about latest scientific developments, useful stuff to pass around. Robert Maxwell treated women appallingly. He treated his staff appallingly. He treated his children appallingly. Gislaine, the youngest, was his favorite. He had a boat named after her, the Lady Gislaine. Robert Maxwell was found dead in the water in 1991, supposedly having fallen overboard from his boat. The reason there was, been a lot of speculation in the wake of that is that shortly after he was found dead and given a hero's burial in the Mount of Olives in Israel,
Right.
It emerged that he had stolen the equivalent of $1 billion from the pension funds of his employees. Gislaine Maxwell, who was in her late 20s, her two of her brothers, Kevin and Ian, went on trial in London for enabling their father. They were acquitted. She, meanwhile, moved to New York in circumstances that were considerably reduced from what she'd grown up with, gone with the helicopters, the planes, the yachts. And she, by her standards, was living impecuniously, which means she had a 2-bedroom apartment.
Right, on the Upper East Side or something.
Right. So into this picture comes the mysterious figure of Jeffrey Epstein. If Gislaine Maxwell's story has a sadness to it, it is because it's at this juncture in her life when, yes, the father who she worshipped, even though he was a bully, he beat her when she would bring her friends home from Oxford. He was dismissive of them. She would be playing chess, I reported in Chasing Gislaine, and he would just come over and lift up her piece and disrupt the game. She thought this man walked on water. And when he died, instead of, believing that with her Oxford education, her extraordinary Rolodex inherited from her dad, which, as you say, had royalty, had leaders from everywhere. I mean, Robert Maxwell had been born in Czechoslovakia, but he was close to the leaders of Russia, America. He owned the New York Daily News at the end of his life. London, Israel, Bulgaria, and Gislaine Maxwell was somebody she was a social asset to her father. She had his Rolodex. She had this education. She spoke multiple languages. And instead of thinking, well, this terrible thing has happened, now I must go out and make the best of it on my own, she turned to Jeffrey Epstein, who she not only sort of fell in love with, but who she viewed as her security blanket, the man who was going to take care of her in the way that her father had taken care of her, but at what price? And this is where things turn so dark and twisted, because, Jeffrey Epstein was not known for, being monogamous. He was also not known, by the way, though, until Gislaine Maxwell enters the picture in the early 1990s. He was not known as a predator of children either. This is something that happens in the 1990s when Jeffrey Epstein's wealth has exploded mysteriously. And it is worth remembering that the Maxwells were supposed to have handed all their millions over, to repay the pension, the employees of the Mirror Group whose pension funds have been robbed. Some of that money went, let's say, missing. At the same time that Jeffrey Epstein's wealth has exploded, and people, have wondered if could be a connection there. We will probably never know. But as his wealth explodes, and as Gislaine Maxwell realizes that the only way she can continue to keep this sick man's attention and stay on his payroll effectively, is to bring him girls. And
what she called the nubiles, which I just found incredibly creepy.
Right. And you also have to remember that Jeffrey Epstein in the 1990s, as he acquires the biggest private townhouse in New York, his private island in the Caribbean, the apartment in Paris, the ranch in New Mexico, the plane, all of it, he becomes reclusive. He hides from plain sight. He conducts all this disgusting stuff behind closed doors. The person who goes out at night into the world, scouting for him, is her. And most people, I met her when I moved to New York in 1997. She would just pop up from time to time.
Right.
You can hear from my accent. I grew up in England, as did she. She would. So it's a small world of British expats in New York.
Right. Sure.
She would pop up, but I didn't. I'd never heard of Jeffrey Epstein in the late 1990s. But you had no idea. What she spent her time doing. There were these stories of she was piloting a helicopter. She'd been off traveling with bold-faced names like Bill Clinton. I mean, it was a head scratcher what she, and yet she clearly had a lot of money because she was always dressed in, couture designer clothing. And she seemed to have a much more interesting and exotic, glamorous, globe-trotting life. But trying to piece it all together was a bit of a puzzle. And she was one of those people, she thought it was sort of funny and sophisticated to talk endlessly about sex. That was a thing. But she was the person who was out and about and hanging out with the plutocracy.
So all those connections that Epstein wanted in whatever his mysterious business was, whether he was a financial advisor or however you want to describe it, she became a sort of social lubricant for him in this whole thing, a sort of social skeleton key for him, from what I can read of it. So they were involved in the beginning, right? From what I understand, and then essentially she found herself as his procuress, I guess is the most OED word I can think of to use. And eventually, as things started we entered into the mid and late teens, Epstein's behavior in Palm Beach got more and more aggressive and obvious. People were picking up on it. When did they sort of go their separate ways?
So around 2003, 4, it would seem that she did try to get out of his orbit. And you're right, Rick, because this is the time when the FBI starts to investigate him in Palm Beach. And there are, as we now know, hundreds of victims. I mean, there are even flyers in Palm Beach schools. And she does, I think, try to get out of his orbit. She meets a guy called Ted Waite, who was from the West Coast as a tech entrepreneur. And, for a while, she definitely tries to separate herself out. Right. And this then, sort of 2004 to 2010 are the years where the FBI is investigating him, and we know that in 2008 Jeffrey Epstein has this dream team, he called them, of lawyers, and he manages to get the federal investigation to go away by doing a plea deal through Alex Acosta, the U.S. attorney at the time for Florida, and copying a plea to 2 state charges for which he one of which was soliciting a prostitute and soliciting sex with a minor, but he goes to do this cushy
work release,
yeah, right, for 13 months, and then when he gets out, he goes back to, it's business as usual, and the usual crowd of plutocrats, including Bill Gates, and even the current Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. I mean, all sorts of luminaries come through his door. He carries on basically with impunity, and his line to all of these people is that it was some young woman had lied about her age, and it was a ghastly mistake, and he carries on as usual. Gislaine Maxwell, however, is sort of unable to outrun the situation, and that is because of a young woman called Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who tragically died earlier this year.
Yeah.
But it's when, so, it turns out that this plea deal that Jeffrey Epstein has done, it turns out to be illegal because it was done without the knowledge of all the victims who've been interviewed by the FBI. And they formed a class action lawsuit. Virginia Roberts was not one of the women who was interviewed by the feds because she had done a runner in the fall of 2002. She'd escaped Epstein and Maxwell. She'd gone to Thailand to do a massage course, and she met the man she would marry, and they ran off and to live in Australia. But the lawyers involved in that class action suit, found her in Australia, and she decided to join this class action suit. And not only did she, publicly come out and talk about what had happened with Jeffrey Epstein and Gislaine Maxwell, she named other men. Mm-hmm. She said Jeffrey Epstein had pimped her out to. One of them was Prince Andrew. Mm-hmm. And what she had that made headlines around the world was this photograph of herself with Prince Andrew, with his arm around her waist, and when she was 17 years old in London. And it was basically when Gislaine Maxwell in early 2015 called Virginia Roberts Giuffre a liar. And Virginia then turned around and sued her for defamation. That lawsuit, although it was ultimately settled, the discovery, all the depositions in that lawsuit is what ultimately really became the backbone of the federal indictment against Jeffrey Epstein finally in 2019, when the political climate had changed by then. And, Julie Brown, excellent reporter, had done her
we know Julie.
Miami Herald. And but the political climate had changed. And so it was that lawsuit that was the backbone of the charges against him. And then after Jeffrey Epstein died, as we know, in peculiar circumstances, the indictment against Gislaine Maxwell, again, even though Virginia Roberts Giuffre was not called to her criminal trial,
right,
the material from that lawsuit was present every day in that courtroom.
So Vicky, there's a long-running theory of the case that a lot of people have wondered about, that Epstein supposedly, and the federal government has seized a lot of this material, so we don't know what's actually on it, but that he recorded these powerful men, and he and Maxwell recorded videos of these powerful men with these girls. What's your theory of that aspect of this case? Because there's an argument that I heard the other day from a Trump supporter who said, well, Trump's trying to just protect a lot of really powerful friends, not just himself. What do you think about that aspect of this whole thing?
Well, I think that's a really reasonable question. Because we do know, look, Virginia Roberts Giuffre definitely named names. We know, and I reported this in Chasing Gislaine, from Alan Dershowitz. And, she made claims about Alan Dershowitz, who was Epstein's lawyer, then Trump's lawyer. That case ultimately settled with her saying she may have been mistaken about Dershowitz's identity. But Dershowitz, one of the reasons he fought Virginia Giuffre was because he wanted to clear his name. He said, despite Jeffrey Epstein coming to him and saying, I'll pay all legal bills, but could you stop talking about this? I want it to go away. Dershowitz said no, but Dershowitz said at the time that Epstein was running around all these guys who were named, saying,
Leon Black, and
I'll settle your bills. I'll pay the legal expenses, but I just want this to go away. So that those names are sitting around. We also know, because we sat there in Gislaine Maxwell's trial, this was the most extraordinary day in court, when they called in the FBI agent who had been there busting into Jeffrey Epstein's townhouse in 2019 when they arrested him when his plane landed at Teterboro. And the FBI agent says, yeah. So we go in and we can see all these DVDs sitting there. And she's asked, well, what did you do with them? She said, well, we leave the house and we don't take the DVDs because they didn't have a search warrant. So then she tells the court, they come back the next day and lo, the DVDs have gone.
What a surprise.
And I mean, it really was remarkable. And they've been removed by Jeffrey Epstein's lawyer and accountant, who then claim that they then bring them back when the FBI has a search warrant. But you are left, sitting there scratching your head about all of this. I will say this, Rick, that the other thing, though, that I found very frustrating sitting through Maxwell's trial was that the scope of it was very narrow. I mean, the government normally only prosecutes cases it thinks it can win.
Right.
And this was a case that was about sex crimes and sex trafficking. And so it was kind of frustrating because you would see Jeffrey Epstein's flight logs come up on a screen and you would see the bold-faced names, whether it was Trump, Clinton, whoever, or the dean of, Harvard, whoever. But you never got to see how the jigsaw puzzle of all this money and power and connections, how it all pieced together. And I think that is why people want to hear from her. This all began among Trump's MAGA base, because there's such suspicion about the quote unquote deep state.
Elites, right.
And how kind of soft power works in the shadows. Well, there is no, in my mind, Jeffrey Epstein's entire career was based on soft power operating in the shadows, and Gislaine Maxwell was at the center of it. So she definitely can answer those questions. She can answer questions, I suspect, about the source of his money. And she can certainly answer questions about all the men in his orbit, because Jeffrey Epstein could never have pulled this off alone. So,
exactly.
But the question is, at what price? One, would she give the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Unlikely.
That was my next question, is knowing what you know about her character, if offered a pardon, whether it is stated explicitly or just tacitly, is she going to understand that the pardon means she says, oh, Donald Trump always left early, he was never around. These other guys, though, they're the ones. I mean,
yes, of course. I mean, this is an extraordinarily smart, sophisticated woman who at this point has got absolutely nothing to lose. She knows she holds all the cards. And of course, she's not going to say anything negative about the man who could pardon her. Of course not. So yes, and we know, I mean, when she was up on her criminal trial, one of the charges against her was perjury.
Yep.
So you have no reason to think that she's not going to say anything that wouldn't be in her self-interest. It is also true, however, though, Rick, that she's probably not been asked before a lot of the questions that Todd Blanche asked her last week. But the public kind of, in a way, and Congress needs to weigh whether getting those questions may be answered selectively is worth making a complete mockery of the American justice system in a crime that I would argue is one of the worst crimes to have occurred in American history. A woman, a grown, privileged, educated women trapping, abusing, trafficking girls. I mean, it's kind of unthinkable.
And almost all these girls, especially the ones from Palm Beach, they were, as they say, west of the interstate girls. They were from disadvantaged upbringings. They were not. They were easy targets for a woman like Maxwell, given her sophistication and the polish she could put on for them. As someone who was pretending to introduce them into a world of wealth and power and generous men, all that stuff. It just, I think it's really helpful that folks, if you really want some amazing background on this, listen to Vicky's series Chasing Gislaine, because it really gives you a perspective on I mean, God, we don't like using this word in our society, but an evil person, someone who is overtly evil and who is an abuser of these young women at a level that's just unthinkable. So, well, Vicky, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming on with me, and thank you for sharing your information about Maxwell. And folks, Vicky, where can folks find you on social media?
You can find Vicky Ward Investigates on Substack. And please do buy my new book with James Patterson, The Idaho 4.
Idaho 4. Get on it.
Right
James
now.
Patterson. I love that guy.
Yes. So we're number one. So,
great. Amazing. So good. Well, thank you, Vicky. We appreciate you coming on. We'll talk to you again very soon.
Thanks, Rick.